Welcome back to Windows on the World. This is part 2 of our Indoctrination as Education show. You can find part 1 previous to this in our archive in Spreaker. Please go to Spreaker because we prefer that, as we have had quite a few things going on YouTube actually disappearing. So some of the stuff in our archive has disappeared from YouTube due to community guidelines. And one of the things we're going to be talking about in this show is how the narrative is controlled. In the first part of the show, I quoted from Bertrand Russell. This was from Education Should Aim at Destroying Free Will. In the book The Impact of Science on Society, published in 1951, the following quotes are found. Education should aim at destroying free will so that after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. Well, it didn't work in my case, and I only really got any form of education when I'd actually left school. So the indoctrination that I received there didn't actually teach me anything that was of any value apart from reading and writing. And we did talk about the whole background of this in the first part of the show. We're going to have a bit of a discussion now. I've got Sandi Afdams who's going to join us, and we're going to talk through this because it's very important as to what is going on and the way people are thinking at the moment, and how some people are thinking outside the box, and the recent rise of populism, which is basically people having common values which they are putting together and getting out there as demands against the ever more controlling aspects of what we know as government on this plantation with which we live on this plantation. And the whole point of it is that we are way beyond what we are indoctrinated to be. So let's get into that. Are you there, Sandi?
Yes, I am. Hi, Mark.
Hi. Yeah. The line's not particularly brilliant here, not as good as usual. So we'll crack on with that, and I'll let you know if you start fading in and out. But
okay.
You've really looked at the education system in some depth, the same as I have, and you've got some things to add, haven't you? So carry on.
Well, I did read a lot of Charlotte Iserbyt's stuff. She wrote an amazing book called The Dumbing Down of America. And she was a senior policy advisor in the Office of Education, Research and Improvement in the US Department of Education. And she had a very senior post, really, and it was during Reagan's administration, the first one. And she began to see that there was something fundamentally wrong, and she blew the whistle on it. And she, in her research, she found that I think it was in 1910 the Carnegies joined together with the Rockefellers, and they having fomented the first, this is 1910, this is before the First World War started. They were about to obviously foment that war, and what they wanted to do was control the way to effectively change society was to create war, and then after that it was the way to control society. So they made this Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, which was a $10 million endowment to the U.S. government, to the government of America and Europe, in order to hasten the abolition of international war, the foulest blot on our civilization. And so really, it was the Carnegies wanted to control education, and they joined with the Rockefellers in order to do it globally, really.
Yeah, and also Andrew Carnegie was very instrumental in putting the library system together. And what happened then was that certain books were allowed in libraries and certain books weren't. Obviously, now we see the results of that as the narrowing of the opinion corridor has carried on, and now we don't see books even being available online. For instance, if you want to order certain books from Amazon, you can't. They're banned. So we have these corporate infrastructures which took over from people like Carnegie, really. You know, Carnegie, the millionaire or billionaire philanthropist. And, of course, these people were social engineers, so they were merely imposing their own elite ideology. And when you look back at some of these people, obviously what's happened is that these ideologies have become part of what we now call society, and they've become very controlling factors within that. However, in the first part of the show, what we discussed was how this controlling of the narrative of everything and how this indoctrination through education would mean that people would be little more than serfs within their own groups, their own allowed groups. Now, this goes slightly against what's now happening, and people have gone against that. So what's happening now is this rise of populism. Obviously, the narrative's going to be controlled. However, what we've seen recently in France and the destruction of 2/3 of speed cameras, actually, I think is a major move forward for humanity, personally.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just great. Though I don't want to trivialise things, but we have got quite heavy in the first part of the show. But yeah, I think that when you look at all this stuff and you put it in context, you then realise that this can't actually work ultimately, because there's always going to be those who will think around it, and the more of this you impose and the more narrow it gets, the more people are going to want to be outside it, and that's what seems to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's another guy called Gary Allen who wrote a book called Dare Not Call It a Conspiracy, and he highlighted the whole thing with the Carnegies, that when this technique is perfected, every government that's been in charge of education for one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or police. And that's what we're facing at the moment. And people, people like the French, Gilets jaunes, they really are, they're fighting against this. But whether it would happen here, I don't know. I mean, on a small scale, there was a car park near me that you could park there for £3 a day, and then just before Christmas, something happened. They put cameras in it. They changed the ticketing, and suddenly it's gone up 500% to £3 an hour. And so the locals, some locals got together and completely vandalised it and said "Merry Christmas, everyone," and just vandalised it all. And I think that, when things get really bad and the corruption becomes so bad, people will start fighting back.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I saw that. I was actually in Glastonbury at the time, and they blacked out all the signs, and basically looks like it's been given over to a private company. Now, the thing is that this is all about the selling off or getting rid of what are called council assets, and I think they're taking it a bit too literally, because they're meant to get rid of anything that's not actually productive. Well, if they're going to get a private company to take that over, which looks like what's happened, it looks like parking on private land kind of situation, and it's no longer a council thing. Well, that in itself is quite interesting, because the Parking on Private Land Association have nowhere near the same powers as the council. They can only issue kind of these, they call them fines, but they can't issue fines because they're not a court, and they don't have the authority of the local authority. So that's all interesting, but it'd be interesting to see whether that carries on, because I saw that they'd got all their new signs up. Have they been taken down again since?
No, it's still £3 an hour. But it'd be interesting to see if the locals do get together and vandalise it again, because it's an outrage. 500% is an outrageous amount to put it up. It's just not fair. It's corrupt.
Well, absolutely it is, and what all this is about is getting rid of private transport. So this is another false paradigm that's been created. So what they did is they set cyclists against motorists, and a lot of these cyclists are really militant because they're all sort of basically victims of the education system, and they think it's really green to cycle everywhere. Well, it isn't. It isn't, because I was listening actually to something today that the actual emissions thing is interesting, because even in the 1970s, in motor vehicles, there was a fella who was very young when he did this, and he still does it actually. He gets your emissions down to pretty much zero, but increases the horsepower of the vehicle. And anyone can do this, and it's a known thing. So in other words, we're only given what is needed to be supplied. And when you start looking at all this stuff, so you've got one side going, oh yeah, we've got to be greener, and and they talk about wind farms and stuff like that, which are no use really whatsoever for the kind of amount of energy that's needed. But also they get co-opted into this fake ideology, which is not really green. So the whole idea of electric cars and all the rest of it, these aren't green. They're actually much more detrimental. And of course, so it's only about control. So the whole thing here is that it's a war on people who have cars. And the reason there's a war on people who have cars is because that's about freedom of choice. Once you take the car away, you've got no freedom of choice. You've got to go on public transport. And you can only go to public transport and in the sort of the vicinity of a train station. So in other words, your ability to live outside cities has been taken away. And one of those points in that book by Alexander Inglis, written in 1918 about secondary education, was that people were going to be moved into cities. Now, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that's all part of the smart city agenda. Going back to then, that's unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, I think this whole thing about the dumbing down is so relevant right now, because with the Extinction Rebellion lot that I'm kind of having a bit of a run-in with here, they don't listen. They don't listen to any facts. They have no facts at all. If you speak to them and say that what are you actually doing, they can't give you an answer. They don't even know the document that they're supposed to be. The government document that is what they're all about. They have not a clue what they're doing, and all they want to do is disrupt. And they did. They had a march on Saturday where they walked up the high street with a black coffin saying, "This is our future." And actually, it is.
Well, it's everyone's future, isn't it?
Exactly. The fact is that but they are narcissists. You have to understand that.
Yes.
But the whole idea is that they are supporting the global warming lie, which is actually going to take them into their own concentration camps, and they're not seeing it. And I've given them leaflets about the wind farms, about the electric cars, about the fact that global warming has been constructed by Maurice Strong and Al Gore and all that stuff. Nobody listens. They just don't have a clue, and they are absolutely conforming to whatever they are told by the mainstream media.
That's absolutely what we're talking about in the first talk, because what we talked about was basically the background of all this, and you can actually go back into the archive and look at social engineers then and now. A lecture that was given by Dr. Richard Day at Mount Sinai Hospital. It was for pupils, basically university students, and it was told to turn off their recording equipment, and he would tell them what was going to happen. It's all happened. It was called The New Barbarians. You can listen to that. We've actually got 2 shows on it. But the thing is about social engineering is these people are victims of social engineering, because they cannot think for themselves. If you cannot think for yourself, then you have no future. These are very simple concepts, and the whole idea of the system of education is to restrict that and put you into the chosen groups. Now, it's interesting that we find that the people who then become future leaders are little more than administrators for this type of system. So in other words, they're mentored into it. So they're mentored into this kind of mentality where it appeals to narcissism, it appeals to people who are stupid, and it appeals to people who like repeating things without looking into them. So in that respect, people like Aldous Huxley and Bertrand Russell had it absolutely right. But in the other respect, they don't, because you can't impose this stuff kind of forever without it becoming obvious. And of course it is obvious, and we have this narrow corridor of opinion, and also the stupidity of the narratives that we're given. So okay, we had Muslim extremism, that was the biggest threat. Now of course it's the rise of the far right. In other words, oh my God, people voted Brexit, we're going to be far right. And this way of controlling public opinion is actually quite retarded within itself, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it really is almost like a I don't know. It's people who just simply don't. They've been controlled, and they don't look any further than, as you say, this narrow corridor of opinion that they've been given. And I don't quite understand why there's some people that do think for themselves, and some don't. And they come out of the same education system. Are some people more susceptible? I don't know. But it's interesting. I mean, I always remember with Charlotte Iserby, she actually published a paper I think it was a pamphlet in 1989 called Soviets in the Classroom, and it highlighted America's latest fad in education, which covered the details of the US Carnegie Soviet education agreements, which kind of are in effect now to this day globally.
Oh yeah, I mean, these billionaire philanthropists were really instrumental in it all. And I remember going to Skibo Castle, where Andrew Carnegie used to sit, in his office. I went into his office, actually. We did a gig there many years ago. I think we were the last people allowed to do a gig there. I think then Madonna had a wedding there or something. But it was interesting, actually, because I just got a little bit of an insight into his kind of mentality, you know, by looking at what was in the library there and all the rest of it. And it is kind of interesting. I mean, where do these people get this entitled worldview that they're going to shape our future? And of course that comes in the so-called elite establishments of education, which are nothing more than programming within themselves. But what's interesting again is that a lot of this stuff cannot work long term. However, the interesting point is that most of what's been talked about since at least the early part of basically, well, let's go back to the 1800s. It's all happened. So we're not really even going back 100 years. It's a very interesting situation.
Yeah. I mean, you're right about the private education system, because they tend to have more competitive sports. They tend to create a more individual personality. And that could be why the elite think of themselves as very different creatures to the rest of the people of, you know, the proletariat, if you want to call it that. But, you know, I just find it really bizarre that some people do grow up and they're entrepreneurial, they think for themselves, they don't have that hive mind mentality, which is actually really, really pushed in mainstream education.
Yeah, that's really true. I mean, the thing is that once you start looking at it in any kind of objective way, you start to see through it very quickly. What's interesting also is that the people I was in school with who were chosen to be the administrators, and they are the administrators now, are entirely dull. And they basically they seem to have stopped learning when they left school, which is also quite interesting. And it goes along with that way that they were chosen through the education system. And the other thing is that education, again, when they said education is not complete until attitudes have been changed. This is the UNESCO thing. So the whole thing about globalism is they have to get into this hive mind, and everything actually revolves around them being within a hive mind. And of course these things like this Extinction Rebellion and previously Occupy were all about hive mind. Occupy was taken over, obviously, Reclaim the Power and Climate Camp and all that stuff. It's all police stuff. And then, of course, you've got the People's Assembly. Anything with People's Assembly or basically the people in is obviously run by the state, okay? So this is what I don't really understand, is that why the public will still go march up and down with placards when it's not going to do any good, because all they're doing is feeding back into what they're trying to oppose. Again, the globalists need the anti-globalists. So all these people are doing is participating in that, which is fine. But when you look at it objectively, you can see that. And you're right that not many people look objectively, but I'm not quite sure why this is. Is it something to do with experience, with life experience? That's a good point, I think, because I think adversity, real adversity, can kind of spark people out, or spark people's interest and get them out of this hive mentality. That's quite an important point. I think it's something that was brought up, though, by social engineers and people like Henry Ford, you know. They've all stepped, but then again, it goes back into this kind of other fake reality of the think and grow rich kind of mentality, you know, which went into the new age and then the entitled personality, you know what I mean? So I think that's an interesting one, because you obviously see a lot of that.
You do, and what you're saying really does have value, because I do think you're right. Struggle creates. It makes the individual. It makes the individual think more and have strategies to cope with life. And I'm wondering, you know, we've got this, you know, the term snowflakes, and there's a lot of them have had it so good they haven't had to think, they haven't had to do anything. I mean, that sounds a bit mean, really, but there is that aspect that we do have a young generation of people that have been almost overprotected and given, you know, that narrow corridor of opinion that they can't see out of.
Yeah, well, that is true, and I've seen a lot of that. I mean, I think that it has to be down to some kind of individual kind of struggle going on. I mean, the thing is that if you're brought up to believe something and then you believe it and you think that's reality, then you're not going to be individualistic and there's no struggle going on. I think there has to be an internal struggle when you're younger, because you have to wrestle with this stuff and go, whether is it true or not? And that can result in different kind of outcomes. In other words, some people end up going very angry and rebellious, and some people might go into a more philosophical type thing, which hopefully is what this sort of show's about, really, because in other words, you're looking for reality in the midst of absolute garbage and the rubbish that's put out. And I was never taught to think properly, so I didn't start thinking properly until I mixed with people who knew how to think, and I was never given access to those people for quite a long time, because when you're put into your social group when you leave school, because I left school basically as soon as I could, and I just did my own thing, but I didn't have the coordinates that I needed to put it all together. Then I went out and gained those coordinates myself and realised that in order to argue anything properly, you need to have a certain level of intellect. And I tried to study what it was which made people intellectuals. In other words, okay, they go through this university degree system. However, when you are introduced to people who have a different method of thinking, that's incredibly important. So this sort of emphasis on being able to express yourself in writing and in speech is incredibly important, because there's a lot of people out there who've got brilliant brains who can do neither of those two things. And that is another important thing that I've come across, in that you come across people who are absolute geniuses, but they can't put it down on paper and they can't properly express it when they need to. So this is another important thing. So the whole thing is all about this internal kind of introspection, really. And I've talked about this to quite a lot of people, and I think you have to spend a lot of time on your own. So in other words, groupthink and being in classes of people and buying into what makes things acceptable is not the way that you can progress. You cannot progress in that way, in my opinion.
No, I see exactly what you mean, because you do find that groups tend to have, again, it's a hive mind mentality, and what you need to do is retain, whilst collaborating or working with others, but maintain your own mind.
That's right.
And that's the most important thing, yeah.
Yeah, Daz has just put into chat, formal education very deliberately switches so many lights out and tricks you into thinking that remember and repeat is actually learning. Not sure whether to ask for my money back or sue them for wasting my time. Now, I had a very similar thing that I don't think you can sue them for wasting your time, because that's part of the indoctrination that you're meant to go through. So they're not wasting your time in their eyes. They're actually giving you something, you know. They're giving you a benefit of society. But then again, being put in prison is a benefit of society according to the system that we're under. And I equated school with what I would think prison would be like. I couldn't stand it. Couldn't wait to get out. But the point is that when I look back at the teachers that I had, I found them all incredibly dull. There was no one who actually seemed to have any joie de vivre or kind of actual knack to what they were doing. And I only found people like that afterwards when I started to specialise. So again, it's very interesting, that, isn't it? I mean, all education is about memory. This is Eric. All education is about a memory test for an exam. It's nothing to do with knowledge. No, knowledge, see, wisdom is another thing that people don't really understand. And the idea of that is where you actually learn. I mean, I met some of these people who were meant to be gurus who were actual idiots. And I've met people who thought they were idiots who were actually gurus. You know, it's kind of it's a kind of interesting thing, that, because it's the way that things are valued. So it doesn't matter what section of society you go to, there things are always kind of valued in a way that is reflective of that particular group. So I've always tried to think outside the box, and most of the pleasure that you get when dealing with these people is to go outside of their experience and basically take apart their belief system, and then they will revert back to their artificial womb, which is to call you a conspiracy theorist, or say that, well, I'm sure I'd know about it if it was that important, you know.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's mad, really. There's also the thing about within this whole system, that the influence of the home is seen as an obstruction, so that anything to do with children need to be almost taken out of the home environment in order to be indoctrinated, because the home is seen as an obstruction.
Well, I think the parents are seen as an obstruction, basically, because if you need the state to look after them from cradle to grave, then you don't need the parents. Interesting point. I don't know whether this is important, but that system in Russia where they took the babies away from their mothers at birth, and they were given back to their mothers several hours later. This was they all put on a trolley. I don't know whether you remember that. This is, I mean, I don't know whether they do it now, but that was a big part of the communist system, in that you had to alienate the child from its parents basically when it was born. And that's quite interesting, but I'm not sure how effective that is. It's effective in creating people who may become dependent on the state, but also there was negative sides to that. In other words, that a lot of people in Russia tended to drink a lot because of that, so it caused an alienation within them. Yeah, so
some sort of detachment.
But I've always found detachment to be a good thing, but I don't think it's maybe a good thing in early parts of people's lives. But I've kind of got a different method of thinking about the whole thing, in that the only insight I've had into things has been when I've been on my own or been detached from a group think, basically. But then again, the idea of the guru comes in, and you meet a teacher who is actually a real teacher, and I've only met real teachers about 3 times in my life. Considering the amount of schooling I had, that's pretty poor, isn't it?
It is pretty poor. I mean, I think I had one teacher at school who was a true mentor. She was she was someone that made you open up and think deeply about things. And she was amazing. She was an Irish woman. But the rest of them were literally, it's like learning by rote and having blackboard rubbers thrown at you, and if you weren't concentrating enough, and it was pretty hideous actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that history was particularly bad, and we had this history teacher, and he came out with one line, and this was when I was at the sort of secondary part of education, probably about 13, 14, and he made a statement, he opened up the lesson with disenfranchised 56 rotten boroughs, right? And it was all about the sort of basically feudalism and stuff like that, and that was the only bit I remember, because that's when I switched off, because he just started waffling on about a load of rubbish after that. I couldn't see what any... So basically, yeah, they have... It's interesting that I remembered certain lines of what these people said, because they were said with emphasis, and then the rest of it was just rubbish. And once I started writing things down, I realised that what they were teaching you was nothing, because there was no detail. So what you would get would be this generalised nonsense that is of no use whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's really strange. I had a very strange Italian geography teacher at school, and she had a very strong Italian accent, and she made us dictate the whole curriculum, and she had this very strong accent, which I found it difficult to understand. And I remember walking out. I was quite a rebel. I walked out of the class and said, "I'm not doing this anymore because I can't understand what you're saying." And nobody else would admit that they couldn't understand what she was saying. And literally, it was learning by rote. We just had to write down a load of facts. And this was for GCSE. And I said, "I'm not going to do it." And she said, "Well, you have to turn up at the exam." And I did. And I passed it. With the little knowledge I had, I passed it. But it was just the most ridiculous thing, where we were just learning by rote from somebody who couldn't speak English properly because she had such a strong accent. And I couldn't understand what she was saying. It was just mad. And that's all she did was dictate the curriculum to us. And we wrote it down. It was awful.
Yeah, I found most of it a bit like that, and the distractions were actually the more interesting things within the class. So, in other words, you try to create a distraction because you were so bored, and there would be...
I did that.
Yeah, they would just, this is where they go on about bad behaviour and stuff like that, but often it's just because it's so dreary and dull, you do anything just to stop it,
Yeah.
But what's interesting is...
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I had sort of a very hyperactive kind of personality, and I didn't sleep really until I was 3, and some tests about why that was and this kind of area, and I don't know too much about it because I've never seen them, but the point about it was that you get diagnosed with things like being hyperactive and stuff like that. Well, I don't think kids are hyperactive. I think they're just active. I mean, the point is it's natural to be hyperactive, but also the interesting point I was trying to make here was that with that sort of brain, or being diagnosed with that sort of brain, then you are only attentive when you're interested in something, and that is the point. So in other words, I would say that's the failure of the education system, in that if you cannot engage people to be interested, then you failed.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I found that. Yeah, go on.
The constant testing of children is. I mean, I know loads of teachers, and most of them are really unhappy in the teaching profession because they're not actually teaching; they are just literally facilitating these exams and marking and assessing these children constantly, and it's like some sort of horrible regime, really. These kids might as well be in a prison, really, and they are, because they're being tested the whole time and assessed.
Yeah, it's incredibly dreary.
The teachers can't teach, really bad. Yeah, and there's many leaving the teaching profession at the moment because they're so unhappy.
Yeah. Well, this kind of ties into the first part of the show we did, which do have a look at that, because I went into immense detail through the social engineers and what education was meant to be about, and what the people who are actually still influencing your children today were saying. It's worth having a look at that part of the show, previous one to this, because the actual idea of social engineering is not really something that's taught in school, and maybe it should be, because then you would learn about what propaganda is, and then you would be able to differentiate and start to think critically, but that's not what it's for, as we found out in the first part of the show. But yeah, getting back to the sort of schooling, I mean, I think that because we went to school quite a long time ago, I mean, I think the education system maybe was slightly different then. I mean, I do speak to some people who teach private now, and they are more the type of teachers that you would kind of, you know, advocate. But the actual, what I've heard of sort of, especially primary school teachers, I mean, the stuff that they come out with and their level of education is so poor that you think, well, this is a very formative time, because the idea of reading and writing is incredibly important, and most people are inarticulate completely these days, and they don't even know how to spell things, and their grammar is appalling. So I think that they basically, the dumbing down through education is pretty complete. In actual fact, I don't think there's much point in it. I don't think I would actually recommend people putting their kids into school, because I didn't see the point of it. I mean, maybe there are people who benefit from it. I think the people who benefit from it are the administrators and people who want to go into it. So it kind of works for certain people, but the level of what you learn doesn't teach you anything. It doesn't teach you absolutely. And then of course there's the idea of people basically defending that, because they go, oh well, you know, what are you, some kind of conspiracy theorist? Well, if we didn't have a system like this, there'd be anarchy. We sort of addressed that in the first part of the show, but this idea of there'd be anarchy if it wasn't this, it's a total misunderstanding of what anarchy is, and it's a total misunderstanding of what the system is, because in actual fact, in most of these kind of situations where people can react naturally to things, then it's not what they call anarchy. There's real anarchy, which means people get on with things, and also a natural hierarchy kind of if you want to use those words, can evolve, unless you've got sociopaths and psychopaths, and they're the people who get promoted anyway. So if you can keep those people out of an equation, you can generally find that a small group of people especially can work very productively towards a goal, which is not what the education system wants, because all of that productivity has to be put into what the state need, which is basically be taxed and be put into the system, which is necessary. So yeah, that's all interesting stuff, you know.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, I think there is quite a move. A lot of people are homeschooling now. Not enough, but I think quite a few people are. I know someone, you know, a lot of people around here homeschool. And I think if I had children again, you know, if I went back in time, I'd do the same thing. I'd homeschool them, because yeah, I mean, I've got 3 kids, and 2 of them have gone to university, and those are the ones that are really not getting what's going on in the world. You know, they only will accept the mainstream media's, you know, view on things, and I'm finding that quite a challenge. The one that didn't go to university is a real free thinker, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, well, of course, that education is not complete until attitudes have been changed, and that was the first quote that we came out with in the show, which I think it's a brilliant quote, that. And I was just looking through all this stuff today with what these people that I'd looked at previously, like John Taylor Gatto and Charlotte Isabet, have been saying. But yeah, just to reiterate that, this is one of the most profound things about education you can possibly say. And this is from this book that came out in 1918 by Alexander Inglis, assistant professor of education at Harvard University. And he stated, all educational theory and practice must be determined primarily by the nature of the individuals to be educated. Reduced to its lowest terms, education is the process of producing, directing, and preventing changes in human beings. So that really does tell you all you need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a scientific destruction of the mind. That's what it is.
That's a brilliant way of summing it up, Sandy, and probably a good place to leave it in this second part. We're going to be covering all this and more in the weeks to come. And of course, we have our shows, our lectures, whatever you want to call them, a way to meet up. It's called The Bigger Picture. And it features myself, Sandy, and of course, Piers Corbyn. And we all are from different areas of thought, and our thoughts and our factual evidence comes together in these talks, which are not only informative but quite fun as well. So if you want to book us, do that through the website windowsontheworld.net. We're going to call it a day there, and we'll be back next week every Sunday, remember, 9 to 11 p.m. Usually at 9 to 10 we do a show, then we often have a bit of an extra show afterwards. And do join us every Sunday. Tell your friends, and tell us about yourselves. Get in touch. That's it from me. And thanks a lot, Sandy.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sandy. And we'll see you next week at windowsontheworld.net. That's it for today. Thanks a lot.